Rosie had always dreamed of a large, loving family, a husband, at least 3 children, and a house full of people. But at 30 years old, wedding bells had never rung for her. She did have a child, though marriage had never come. At 17, Rosie fell in love. It felt like forever. Colin was her classmate, the most handsome boy in school, and when he noticed plain, white-haired Rosie, she felt transformed from an ugly duckling into a beautiful swan. But that was only in her mind. In reality, she remained the same skinny, angular girl. Colin, as it turned out, had simply made a bet with his classmates that he could charm her. And he succeeded. Rosie believed him, and after the graduation party it happened. Then Colin told everyone about it. Rosie wanted to die, only her mother supported her, never condemning or judging. Yes, Harriet learned everything from neighbourhood gossip, but she didn't rush to scold her daughter or punish her. She simply came home, saw her crying daughter, hugged her and whispered, "Don't worry, you'll still find happiness." Colin soon left for the capital to study and stayed there, while Rosie enrolled in the local college. Everything seemed fine until she started feeling ill. Again, her mother was there. With maternal instinct, she understood, without doctors, and convinced her daughter to seek medical advice. 5 or 6 weeks pregnant, the doctor confirmed. Rosie cried again. Her mother was stunned at first, but quickly gathered herself and said, "I won't let you harm yourself. If you have this baby, I'll help you raise it." And so Harriet and Rosie welcomed a beautiful girl named Dana. Sweet and lovely, Rosie saw Colin in all her features. The girl had his brown eyes, his wavy dark blonde hair. The young woman wanted him to know about his daughter, but Colin had vanished without a trace. His parents, too, seemed to disappear from the city. 2 years later, Rosie returned to the college, where she'd only completed 1 year before. Harriet kept her promise to help with her granddaughter. Their all-female household had a warm, friendly atmosphere. Dana grew up surrounded by love and care, much like Rosie had, also without a father. Rosie began to believe in a family curse, a crown of celibacy, and it made her bitter. She thought she'd never be a wife, and Dana would never have a father. Harriet dismissed these thoughts with all her might. "Just because I've been alone doesn't mean the same will happen to you. You'll find your person," she'd say. But Rosie would just shake her head doubtfully. Who would want her now, with her daughter? Though Rosie loved her little girl more than life itself. Over time, thoughts of Colin faded. The feelings disappeared, leaving only resentment at his cruel behaviour. Rosie believed they'd meet again some day and he'd face consequences. Years passed. She graduated, found a prestigious job at a trading company, and earned well. Dana started school and Harriet worked at an accounting centre. Life moved forward. Gradually, imperceptibly, Rosie transformed from a grey mouse into a beautiful woman, yet she paid no attention to men. Burned in her youth, she viewed all men as treacherous and ignored their advances. Harriet scolded her for this. "Daughter, you're so young, you need to build your own family," her mother would say. "You and Dana are my family," Rosie would answer. "That's not enough," Mum would object. "You should marry. Dana needs a father, brothers and sisters." But Rosie refused to listen. Her dreams of a large family lay buried beneath past hurts. Then at 30, it seemed the crown of celibacy might finally lift. She met Gabriel by chance. Rosie was driving to a neighbouring city on business when her car broke down on the highway. The forest surrounded her, snow was swirling and darkness was falling. Rosie worried wolves might appear soon. Worse still, no cars stopped despite her emergency lights. What could she do? Her phone had no signal. Then an old car pulled up nearby. A tall man stepped out and approached her car. "Need help?" he asked. Rosie nodded firmly. For years she'd never needed a man's help, but now she welcomed it. The man checked under the hood and said the car needed a service centre. "Can we call for help out here?" Rosie asked, confused. The man smiled. "I can tow you with a cable. It's about 15 kilometres to town. There's a repair shop that stays open late. What do you say?" "I'm in." "Perfect. I'm Gabriel, by the way." "Rosie." Gabriel quickly towed Rosie's car to the workshop. While the mechanic made repairs, they sat in his car drinking hot coffee from a nearby kiosk and chatting. Gabriel proved quite friendly, explaining that he'd owned a window installation business in town, but it had failed due to competition. He was exploring new opportunities and staying optimistic. Something would work out. For some reason, Rosie liked this cheerful man and found herself smiling back. She mentioned being in town for work, recently promoted to department head, with business trips now part of her routine. "And your husband doesn't mind?" Gabriel asked with a smile. "No husband," Rosie replied simply. "I live with my daughter and mother." She was surprised at the ease with which she told a stranger about her life, but something about this man seemed trustworthy. The car was fixed quickly. Rosie said goodbye to her assistant and went to the hotel. Finally, Gabriel handed her his business card. "Maybe you'll find time to call me in your busy schedule," he said timidly. She responded with a smile and a nod. She was eager to continue communicating with Gabriel. For perhaps the first time in her life, she didn't view a man as some kind of traitor. The next day, work kept her busy and distracted, but in the evening at her hotel, Rosie decided to call him. As if waiting for her call, he answered on the first ring. Delighted to hear Rosie's voice, he invited her to dinner. Like a schoolgirl, she enthusiastically accepted. At the restaurant, they chatted like old friends, and when Gabriel walked Rosie back to her hotel, he asked hopefully if they could meet again. She agreed. True, she had to leave in the morning, but was that really a problem nowadays? They had phones, and distance hardly mattered. As she fell asleep, Rosie smiled. She believed she'd found happiness. Gabriel's current financial troubles didn't worry her. She could see he was serious and would sort everything out. But in the morning, as she left the hotel, a young blonde approached her. With a mocking look, she said, "So, you're the one trying to steal my husband?" "I'm sorry, I don't understand," Rosie said, confused. "You're confusing me with someone else." "Not at all," the blonde sneered. "I heard about you two cooing like lovebirds in the restaurant yesterday. Don't be surprised, our town is small. Everyone knows everyone. A waitress who knows you spotted my Gabriel. Let me warn you now. Stay away from my husband." "Husband?" Rosie echoed in shock. "Yes, Gabriel is my husband. Do you think a man like that would be single? We've been married for 3 years. What did he tell you? That's typical. It's in his nature. He flirts with anything in a skirt." The blonde twitched her shoulder nervously and continued, "Just forget about my husband. He's mine. Besides, he won't leave me. He's completely dependent on me. He plays at running his business, but I'm his source of money." "I understand," Rosie said quietly and walked to her car. God, how she wanted to cry. No, she wanted to howl. For the first time, she'd believed she'd met a genuine man, but he turned out to be just another Casanova, and married no less. He hadn't mentioned his marital status, but then again, she hadn't asked. She'd noticed no ring on his finger and assumed he was single. How stupid she'd been. Berating herself, she began her journey home. Gabriel called several times during the trip, but Rosie ignored his calls, determined never to speak with him again. They hadn't even kissed yet, and she was already imagining their happy future. She would simply erase these 2 days from her life. She blacklisted Gabriel's number. Yet he called again a few days later from a different phone. "Hello?" she heard his uncertain voice. "Rosie, what happened? You left so suddenly. We didn't even say goodbye. Why haven't you answered my calls?" "Don't call me again," she replied coldly. "Rosie, wait!" he shouted. "I think I understand. Did you meet my wife? Or rather, my ex-wife? Did she tell you we're still together and happy? Don't believe her. I left her 6 months ago, but she won't let go, refuses to divorce me. I've filed for divorce twice already. Nothing connects us anymore. We've been strangers for ages. No children, and she was unfaithful. She always expected me to be her puppet. She threatens me with her wealthy father. He's the one who basically ruined me. But I won't go back to her, Rosie. Why aren't you saying anything?" She remained silent. Part of her wanted to believe him, but Rosie realised she knew nothing about this man. Why did she need such complications? "Don't call me again," she said softly and ended the call. Then, alone in her bathroom, Rosie cried. She would never find happiness. But what was she really upset about? She had a wonderful daughter, her mother was healthy, she had a good job and a nice apartment. What more did she want? Love? Many women lived without it. She could too. Later Harriet noticed her daughter's gloomy mood and tried to have a heart-to-heart talk. But for the first time ever, Rosie didn't want to confide in her mother. Only Dana brought her comfort. She helped with homework, took walks with her daughter, and gradually found peace. She had someone to live for. Then one day she found little Dana in tears. After a long silence, the girl confessed that her schoolmates teased her for not having a father. "You have a father," Rosie replied, dismissing the cruel words. "But if I have one, where is he?" Dana asked through tears. "Why doesn't he give me birthday and New Year's presents? Why doesn't he live with us? Why doesn't he ever visit?" The questions were fair, but Rosie had no answers. She managed to comfort her daughter, but knew her explanations were weak. Having grown up fatherless herself, Rosie understood Dana's pain. At that moment, her own troubles seemed insignificant. Yes, Dana needed a father, but where could she find one? The curse of perpetual solitude. What could she do about it? Then on New Year's Eve, everything changed. While shopping for holiday groceries after work, she literally bumped into Colin, her first love, and Dana's father. He had aged, looking more solid and even more handsome than before. "Rosie, is it really you?" Colin explained joyfully. "You look beautiful, amazing." "Thank you," Rosie replied shyly. "You look good too." Colin smiled contentedly. "Shopping for groceries? Let me wait for you, I've only bought this." He held up a lonely loaf in a bag. "Maybe I could walk you home. We have so much to catch up on." And Rosie, who had spent years imagining how she would turn this scoundrel away, simply nodded. She suddenly realised that she was surprisingly happy to see the man who had once hurt her so cruelly, even though she thought she had forgiven him long ago. Rosie walked quickly through the store, putting groceries in her basket. She had forgotten half of what she needed, her thoughts consumed by the upcoming conversation with Colin. When she finished at the cash register, he waited patiently by the exit. Together they walked silently out of the store. "Shall we go to a cafe?" he asked. She nodded. At the cafe they sat in silence until Colin gathered the courage to ask, "Well, how are you?" "Fine," she shrugged. "You'd better ask how Dana is doing." "Who's Dana?" he asked, raising his eyebrows. "Your daughter." "I have a daughter?" Colin exclaimed. "Rosie, why didn't you tell me all these years?" "How could I? You vanished after bragging to everyone about us. You won your bet with your friends." "Oh, Rosie, forgive me, I was such a fool," Colin said bitterly, still processing the news. "A daughter! I never imagined. And no one told me, though I haven't spoken to anyone from those days since then. Tell me, what's she like?" "She's a typical 12-year-old girl. Goes to school, takes dance classes, draws a little." "A creative kid. What does she look like? Do you have a picture?" "She looks like you," Rosie replied calmly, surprised by her own composure. She showed Colin a picture of Dana on her phone. "Exactly like me," Colin noted with satisfaction. "I've wasted so many years. I had a daughter growing up and didn't know it. Will you let me see her? Or Will your husband object?" "I'm not married. I live with my mum." "With your mother? How is your mum? She must hate me." "Mum is fine, and we haven't talked about you in years." Rosie met his gaze steadily. He looked at her again, then touched her arm lightly. "Rosie, maybe we should try again." "Start over? Why?" "Because we have a daughter." "So what? You haven't been lonely all these years, have you?" Rosie smiled sadly, remembering her failed relationship with Gabriel. "I'm alone now. Yesterday, my life seemed to be falling apart, but now I realize fate is giving me a second chance," Colin admitted. "I can hardly believe this is happening." Colin shared his story. After graduating from high school, he had fled the city. Yes, he had won the bet and gossiped about Rosie. He claimed now that he had wanted a fresh start, too ashamed to look her in the eye. He went to university to study programming. His parents soon moved in with him after inheriting an apartment in the capital region from his grandmother. In his 5th year, Colin met his future wife, Meg, who was slightly older and ran her own business. They married after graduation, but their family life quickly crumbled under the weight of daily routine. Meg worked constantly, while Colin yearned for warmth and comfort, leading to frequent quarrels. Though he had a good job with a decent salary, he earned less than his wife, who often criticised him for it. Eventually, Meg found someone else and asked him to leave her apartment. "I simply bored her," Colin sighed, recalling his failed marriage. She had initiated the divorce. Colin moved to his parents in the region, and everything fell apart. His boss harassed him over nothing and cut his salary. Despite his talents, he couldn't find another programming job. That's when I decided to start fresh. I returned to my hometown. My old friends were gone, and I barely know anyone here, but I'm not giving up. Now I'm job hunting and hoping to find something soon," Colin concluded. As Rosie listened, she realised her resentment toward Colin had vanished. Instead, she felt something like pity for the man who had once broken her heart. Or was it love that had simply been dormant all these years? "I have to go." Rosie stood up. Colin jumped to his feet. "We'll meet again, won't we?" he asked hopefully. "I think so. Did you want to meet your daughter? I can arrange that." "Great, when?" Colin smiled. "I need to think about it." "What's there to think about?" he exclaimed. "Invite me over for New Year's Eve. I'm sure Dana and I will get along. But how will your mother feel about it?" "I can't answer that right away. I told you I need to think it over," Rosie replied thoughtfully. They left the cafe. As Rosie drove away, Colin stood on the sidewalk, watching her car disappear, absently tapping his fingers on a loaf of bread. A smile played on his face. He was genuinely happy to see her, and knowing about his daughter gave him new strength and confidence. When Rosie entered her apartment, she heard Dana crying. Harriet tried to comfort her, but the girl's tears only flowed harder. "What happened?" Rosie looked into her daughter's room in surprise. "Nothing," Dana sobbed, burying her face in her pillow and crying even harder. Unable to get any response from her daughter, Rosie sat down beside her, stroked her head, and looked pleadingly at her mother. Harriet sat with her lips pressed together. Soon Dana, having cried herself out, fell asleep, and the women left the nursery. "What happened?" Rosie whispered. "She had a fight with her friend," Harriet answered. "She said her father would give her a tablet for New Year's Eve, but Dana's father wouldn't give her anything because she doesn't have one. And she also called Dana a fatty. Can you imagine? That's what her parents say among themselves. I thought better of them." "And our Dana?" "She said nothing, just slapped her friend on the forehead and pushed her into a snowdrift. Her mother already called us at home. I gave her a piece of my mind too." "Adults shouldn't get involved in children's quarrels," Rosie replied admonishingly. "Daughter, you don't understand. They didn't just hurt Dana, they hurt you too. exclaimed Harriet. "Well, to hell with them. Let them mind their own business," Rosie replied quietly. "Besides, soon Dana will calm down. She'll have a daddy." "Rosie, you've finally found a worthy man?" her mother exclaimed, clutching her heart. "My God, I don't believe it." "I don't think you'll be so happy when you find out who it is." Rosie grinned and told about her chance meeting with Colin in the store. Harriet listened in silence, occasionally shaking her head thoughtfully. "Did you really forgive him?" she asked at last. "I thought I hadn't, but when I saw him I understood that I had forgotten all the bad things. Besides, he is Dana's father," Rosie replied, adding, "though even if he talks to his daughter it doesn't mean I'll fall into his arms." Harriet only smiled sadly, but didn't oppose Colin and Dana meeting. Let them talk. After all, meeting her father might help our granddaughter calm down, become more confident. "Should we bake geese instead of chicken for New Year's? And add several more salads?" said Harriet. "We'll have a man as a guest after all." "So you don't mind if I invite him?" Rosie asked, barely concealing her joy. "How could I mind? He's not a stranger. What can I do?" Harriet replied with a sigh. And so Colin was invited to the New Year's celebration. "How did Dana react to news of my coming?" Colin asked nervously. "I haven't told her yet, in case you change your mind," Rosie answered, though surprisingly, my mum hadn't objected. "I see. Harriet is a wise woman, but perhaps you should prepare Dana." "Just come and bring a present for your daughter." "Yes, of course. What should I give her? A doll or sweets? She's probably too old for dolls now." Rosie smiled. "She has enough sweets. You know, if you don't mind, get her a tablet. Nothing expensive, just a basic one she can use online. She needs it for her studies. All her friends have one." "A tablet?" Colin repeated uncertainly. "Yes, all right, I'll buy one." Truthfully, Rosie could tell from his tone that he was unlikely to buy such a gift for their daughter. It was a test of how serious he was about reconnecting with his daughter. But to her surprise, on December 31st, Colin arrived with not only a tablet, but 2 bouquets of flowers. "This is for you, Harriet," he said graciously, presenting Rosie's mother with roses. Harriet smiled contentedly. "And these are for you, Rosie," Colin said breathlessly, offering lilies to the young woman. He had remembered Rosie had always loved lilies. Just then, Dana peeked out from her room, where the Christmas tree sparkled with lights. Confusion crossed her face. Who was this tall, distinguished-looking uncle, bringing flowers to Mum and Grandma? He didn't look like Santa Claus. "Dana, this is for you." Colin handed the box to the girl. "It's a tablet. I hope you'll like it." "A tablet?" Dana repeated in disbelief. "But that's such an expensive gift, especially from a stranger." "Well then, let's get acquainted," Colin smiled. "I'm your dad." The girl froze at these words. Rosie also tensed. She hadn't expected him to introduce himself so directly. Why announce it right at the doorstep? How would Dana take it? Meanwhile, Dana looked at them in confusion, then at her grandmother, before crying out, "Daddy!" and throwing herself into Colin's arms. He lifted her up, embracing her. "Daddy, I've waited so long for you," the girl said in a breaking voice, then turned to her mother and grandmother, adding, "See, Santa Claus does exist. I wrote him a letter this year, asking for a daddy." "Santa Claus is truly magical," Colin smiled. "See, here I am." "Are you really my dad?" "I'm your and very own real one. Look, we even have the same eyes." Colin carried Dana to the hallway mirror. They studied their reflection. Indeed, father and daughter looked remarkably alike. Dana and Harriet stood watching this scene quietly. While the older woman still harboured doubts about Colin's sincerity, Rosie gazed at her first love and smiled. Yes, now they would surely be together. It turned into a truly joyful New Year's Eve. The four of them gathered at the festive table, enjoying the food and conversation. Dana laughed merrily, looking between her mother and newly appeared father. Rosie glowed, her eyes sparkling, a gentle blush on her cheeks. Colin was the perfect gentleman. Even Harriet began to smile. Well, that's how life sometimes goes. Things don't work out at first, but then fate brings people back together. Perhaps this was her daughter's destiny. May she find happiness. Throughout the New Year's holidays, Colin visited Rosie and their daughter, bringing small gifts. They went skating around the city, sledding, visited the cinema and theatre. It seemed as if those long years of separation had never existed. All past hurts were forgotten. They were together, and that was happiness. "Rosie, marry me," Colin whispered one evening as they walked through the city, his arms around her. Dana was staying with her grandmother, and the young couple had decided to take a walk alone. Streetlights illuminated the falling snow, huge fluffy flakes settling softly on tree branches, houses, benches. Rosie's eyelashes and coat. Hearing Colin's words, she froze. "Do you really want this?" she whispered. "Very much. I want Dana to be legally mine too," Colin said. "Darling, I've realised I need no one else in this life. I love you. I love our daughter." "I love you," whispered Rosie. On the first working day of the new year, Rosie and Colin went to the registry office to file their marriage application. They decided not to have a wedding, just a simple signing ceremony. Why bother with all the formalities? Mendelssohn's Wedding March never played in Rosie's life. A month later, everything at the registry office was mundane and businesslike. No guests attended. Colin's parents couldn't come. Harriet was slightly ill that day, and Dana was at school. But none of that mattered. Now Rosie was married, her days of being single behind her. Colin moved in with Rosie and quickly adapted to the new apartment, becoming a full-fledged master of the household. Having not yet found employment, he focused on organising their home. First, Colin suggested renovating the bathroom, which Rosie happily agreed to. The apartment had long needed a man's touch. Harriet quietly provided money for the bathroom renovation. She had saved some money. "Perhaps we should hire a construction crew," she asked her son-in-law. "My hands are perfectly capable," Colin smiled back. "Do you think a programmer doesn't know how to lay tiles and change faucets? It seems to me everyone should stick to their expertise," Harriet answered diplomatically. She disliked that her son-in-law showed little interest in job hunting. "What is this? Will my daughter now support not only her child but also her husband? Why should she?" Harriet, still working herself, couldn't understand how a young man could stay home all day. She kept quiet around her daughter, seeing how lovingly she looked at her husband. And Dana was simply radiant. "Well, let him at least complete the repairs, then we'll see," she decided. To her surprise, Colin handled the renovation skillfully, and their bathroom was quickly transformed. "We should tackle the bedroom next," said Colin, as the women gazed in amazement at the precisely laid bathroom tiles. "Oh, son-in-law, we don't have money for that yet," Harriet replied, "unless you can think of something yourself." "Unfortunately not," Colin admitted sheepishly. "What about Dana's room instead?" Rosie suggested. "I can provide money for that." "You're right, my daughter should grow up in a beautiful room," Colin agreed. "Honey, don't worry. I'll find work and become the provider. For now, let's re-wallpaper the nursery and fix the ceiling. How much money do you have? We need to know what we can buy." Rosie named the amount, suggesting they could visit the construction store together tomorrow. "It's not a woman's place to wander among linoleum and paint cans," Colin responded. "I'll handle it myself, don't worry." Rosie shrugged, letting Colin decide. She trusted his taste completely, after seeing the bathroom results. During the renovation, Dana temporarily moved to her grandmother's room. But the girl didn't mind. These were temporary inconveniences. Soon Colin finished her room, and by summer he had gradually renovated the whole apartment. Harriet and Rosie continued providing money for repairs. "Now it's perfect," Colin said one day, admiring his work. "We won't be ashamed to have guests." "Guests?" Harriet asked, surprised. "Who, exactly?" "Maybe my parents or other relatives?" Her son-in-law shrugged, and Harriet merely nodded slightly. She remembered that they were very arrogant people. Perhaps they had changed over time. Since Colin's arrival, the in-laws had called a few times, speaking to Harriet with careful politeness, but never extending invitations nor accepting any. "Of course they should visit us. They haven't even met their granddaughter," Harriet responded. "They'll come," Colin smiled. Rosie was open to meeting Colin's parents and suggested visiting the capital in summer, but her husband always found reasons to avoid it. One day, Colin proudly announced that he had found a job. His new workplace was at the opposite end of the city. "It's quite far, but that's fine. I'll leave early. An hour and a half by bus should be enough," he shrugged. "No, that won't do." Rosie shook her head. "You need a car. I could lend you mine, but my work requires constant travel." "Understandable," Colin agreed. "But when could I possibly buy a car? In 10 years, maybe, and even that's not certain." "Take out a loan," Rosie suggested. "After working for a year, you can get one." Colin replied gloomily. Then Rosie had an idea. "Let me take out the loan," she smiled. "What difference does it make whose name it's in? We're family." "I feel uncomfortable about this, Rosie." Colin hesitated. "What will your mum say?" "What can she say? It's fine. After all, you've renovated the apartment yourself. Consider it your payment." "Well, if you put it that way." Colin smiled uncertainly before hugging his wife. "Oh, Rosie, how could I live without you? I love you so much." "I love you too." Soon it was done. Rosie took out the loan, Colin chose a car, started work, and their family life fell into proper rhythm. The spouses left for their offices in the morning, met for dinner in the evening, discussed work, and made plans for the future. Dana was happy. Mum and Dad together? That was wonderful. Only Harriet still regarded her son-in-law with scepticism. He had lived mostly at his wife's expense, and now she had bought him a car. Was this too high a price for Dana to have a father? Still, she tried not to voice her opinions, avoiding any potential blame. Time passed. Colin's parents never visited. They seemed completely disinterested in their son's family, never sending anything for their granddaughter. Though this hurt Rosie somewhat, she chose not to dwell on it, let it rest on their conscience. Colin worked as a programmer, Rosie at her firm, frequently travelling for business. Harriet's health began to decline, and eventually she had to leave her job for medical reasons. And then the worst happened. Doctors discovered that the woman had cancer. Endless trips to clinics and treatment began. Rosie supported her mother through everything, and her mother helped too, convinced they could overcome it all. But the miracle didn't happen. Harriet died after several months of treatment. Rosie took care of the funeral. Colin avoided helping, saying he was uncomfortable with the hassle. "Of course it's not your mother," Rosie told him then. "Do you want my mother dead?" Colin was indignant. "What are you saying?" she objected weakly. "I don't wish anything bad for your mother or father, but they could at least come to the funeral. We've lived together for 2 years, and they're like strangers to me." "Oh, don't start." Colin waved away. Rosie looked at her husband for a long moment. Was this really her man beside her? She thought about it for the first time. Did he love her, or was he just with her because it was convenient? The woman didn't want to think about it now. There were enough other worries. After burying her mother, Rosie fell apart. She didn't want to eat, do housework, or go to work. Her mother, Harriet, had always been there in Rosie's life, always supporting her. Yes, Rosie understood that her mother had accepted her marriage to Colin only for her granddaughter's sake and merely tolerated him. Harriet had endured so much in her life. She'd raised her daughter alone as a single mother, hadn't said a word when Rosie gave birth right after school, endured the neighbours' gossip, and worked until the end to contribute to their household budget, never thinking of herself. And now she was gone. It was painful for Rosie to accept that her mother was gone, and she had to move on. Yes, her husband was around, but something between them had recently torn apart. Colin had become more distant, quiet, often staying late at work. Rosie didn't think much of it. Just a lot of work, temporary difficulties. These things happen. Dana was also suffering deeply from her grandmother's passing. The girl would often be found with her granny's picture, sitting and crying. Rosie tried to comfort her daughter at such moments, but it didn't work well, and they'd end up sobbing together. Colin would simply leave the house at the sight of this, as if he'd become a stranger to them. Even Dana had mentioned this to Rosie. "It's just hard for everyone," the woman had sighed in response. "Everything will work out." Though, truthfully, Colin had never shown much love toward Dana during their time together. Dana called him Daddy, he called her daughter, sometimes drove her to school, but he never showed interest in her life, never joked with her, never played with her, never bought her gifts. That tablet was the only gift. Initially, Rosie thought he just needed time to adjust to being a father, but almost 2 years had passed and nothing had changed. Sometimes Rosie wondered if Dana needed such a father. Then she'd quickly push that thought away. Of course, she did. At least now no one could say her daughter was fatherless. 2 months after Harriet's death, Rosie finally pulled herself together and threw herself into work and household chores. In August, she sent Dana to a children's health camp. The girl had calmed down somewhat after her grandmother's death, and a change of scenery would do her good. "How will you manage here without me?" Dana asked thoughtfully as they stood by the departing camp bus. "Everything will be fine," Rosie smiled. "You rest and gain strength before school." "And he didn't even come to see me off," Dana said quietly. Colin had left for work very early that morning without even kissing his daughter goodbye. Though hurt, Rosie decided not to show her emotions to her daughter. "Daddy will call you often. He just had to go to the office early today," though she wasn't really sure where Colin had gone so early. After seeing her daughter off, Rosie spent the whole day at work running like a squirrel in a wheel, calling Dana between tasks to check how she was doing at camp. Hearing her daughter's cheerful voice calmed her. Her girl seemed to be returning to normal, thank God. That evening, arriving at the apartment, Rosie found an unfamiliar young woman in the kitchen. The stranger was eating candy with her tea. Rosie noticed it was the box of sweets she'd bought for Dana. Her daughter had left it unopened on the table in her room, and now this woman sat there, brazenly helping herself. She was a stunning blonde with long nails and slightly enhanced lips. "Hello," the girl smiled and stood up, showing off her perfect figure. "I'm Sandy." "Sandy?" Rosie furrowed her brow. The name meant nothing to her. "Yes, Sandy, Colin's cousin. He should have told you," the girl answered, looking slightly confused before smiling again. "What a scatterbrain! He forgot again. He promised he'd warn you." "Warn me about what?" Rosie asked. "That I'd be staying with you for a while," Sandy answered simply. "He didn't say anything. Where is he?" "He went to the store. You only had these sweets for tea. I found them in the room. He ran out to buy something else." Rosie slowly sat down across from the blonde. "Well, Sandy, tell me where you're from. Somehow I never knew you existed." Sandy smiled radiantly and was about to speak when the front door slammed and Colin entered the kitchen. "Ah, girls, you've met?" he asked cheerfully, setting out his purchases. Candy, chocolate, wine, meat, delicacies and cake. Rosie noted her husband's unusual generosity. He typically wasn't so extravagant with groceries. Given his modest income, this spending was surprising. After all, Rosie was the main provider in the family. She still paid his car loan. "Honey, why didn't you mention your cousin before?" Rosie asked, looking between her husband and his suddenly appeared cousin. "I don't remember any cousin Sandy." "Well, Sandy's from the capital. When we lived there, my parents and I didn't have much contact with her family. Then, when we moved here, we saw each other more often. I didn't tell you about her because it never came up," Colin answered, opening the wine bottle. "What do you say, girls? Shall we have a drink?" "I don't want to," Rosie refused. "I have an important day at work tomorrow. But tell me more about yourself, Sandy." "What's there to tell?" Sandy shrugged. "I lived in the capital, got married. My husband was a businessman, everything was fine. Then he started going out, beating me, humiliating me. I called Colin the other day to complain. He immediately asked me to come and stay with him. I've got nowhere else to go with this tyrant." "What about your parents?" "They're totally on his side. In fact, my whole family thinks I'm very lucky to have married Craig, but they didn't live with him." Sandy brushed away a tear and fell silent. Rosie even felt sorry for the girl. Yes, she had a difficult fate. "Do you have children?" she asked. "Children?" Sandy asked absent-mindedly. "No, Craig didn't want to hear about them. I'm telling you, he's a tyrant." "I sympathise," Rosie replied sincerely. Colin and Sandy drank wine while she drank tea. The cousins chatted idly, remembering common relatives. Sandy's mood had lifted and she was laughing now and then. For some reason, her laughter slightly irritated Rosie, but she decided not to pay attention to it. All people are different. "You could have warned me that your cousin was coming to visit," whispered Rosie to Colin when Sandy went to the restroom. "Well, I'm sorry it was spontaneous. Besides, you were lost in your thoughts, then busy with Dana. I decided not to burden you with our problems." "And you're against it? If so, I'll tell Sandy right away." "No, let her stay. There's enough room for everyone," Rosie replied, conciliatory. She didn't want to be known as the evil one among Colin's relatives who expelled relatives. His parents might never visit if she did, and there was still a small chance to establish relations with Colin's family. Sandy settled in the room where Harriet had recently lived. Rosie was a little hurt by this, but didn't argue. Where else could they put her? Not in Dana's room. "Sandy, how long are you staying with us?" Rosie asked while making up the sofa. "I don't know. A week or two. If Craig doesn't apologise, maybe longer." "So you'll go back to him?" Rosie was surprised. "What can I do? I've never worked. He supports me. He'll get over it, calm down, realise he was wrong, and ask for forgiveness. I won't forgive him easily, of course, only if he arranges a trip to Paris for me. No, better Dubai." Sandy squeezed her eyes shut happily, and Rosie looked at her new relative with bewilderment. How shallow and mercenary. She had just been crying in the kitchen about her monster husband, but now she was already planning to sell her forgiveness. After wishing Sandy good night, Rosie went to her bedroom. Colin was in the shower at the time. Rosie grinned, noting that her husband's mood had improved dramatically after his cousin's arrival. Well, at least some good came from Sandy. She called her daughter to tell her about the news. "It's like snow on your head," Dana remarked. "Exactly," Rosie laughed. "And how are you doing? Have you found any girlfriends?" "Everything's great, Mum, don't worry. Got to run, they're calling us to the party." Rosie smiled as she put the phone away. Dana's voice was cheerful. She was coping after her grandmother's death. Let her enjoy herself. Lost in thoughts about her daughter, she fell asleep and didn't hear when Colin came in. She woke up only in the morning. Somehow, the alarm hadn't gone off. "Oh God, I overslept!" Rosie gasped and rushed to get ready. Colin sat in the kitchen. "Colin, why didn't you wake me up?" she called out. "I told you, I have an important day today." "I forgot," he answered, then added, "Will you make breakfast for me and Sandy?" "Colin, When? Rosie shouted from the shower. You'll figure something out. I don't have time. By the way, why aren't you going to work? I took the day off. Forgot to tell you yesterday. Oh, so you're spending the day with Sandy? Rosie rushed from the bathroom just as a sleepy Sandy drifted out of the living room. What's all the yelling about? She asked, yawning. I overslept, Rosie smiled. I see. The relative replied indifferently and meandered to the kitchen. She and Colin were discussing breakfast plans, but Rosie didn't stay to listen. 10 minutes later she rushed out without even kissing her husband goodbye. He wouldn't take offence. Rosie's day was scheduled down to the minute. Customers, contracts, new suppliers. She had to drive to the suburbs to coordinate work details. Rosie finished at 9 and coming home found that Colin and Sandy were not home, and the apartment was a mess. Unmade beds, a sink full of dirty dishes, and her favourite towel lying on the bathroom floor. Rosie's shoulder twitched nervously as she called her husband, but he didn't answer. Perhaps that was for the best. She might have said things she'd regret. After calming down, she started cleaning. Just as the washing machine finished, the dishes were sparkling, and she was mopping the hallway floor. Colin and Sandy arrived, looking happy and satisfied. Oh, Rosie, Colin smiled. Getting things done here? Sandy and I took a walk around the city. I gave her a tour of my childhood haunts. Sandy giggled, and Rosie could tell she was drunk. What's with the state of the house? Rosie asked while wringing out the mop. Why is the towel on the floor? And why didn't you wash your dishes? I can't wash dishes, Sandy slurred. I have a manicure, and the towel, that's how they do it in hotels. You leave it on the floor for the servants to wash. So you used my best towel as a bath mat? Rosie frowned. Even though I gave you a complete set of linens and towels, I'm not your maid. If you want to live in my apartment, you'll need to clean up after yourself and use what you've been given. I can tell I'm not welcome here. Sandy hummed and stumbled into the living room, dropping onto the sofa. Rosie, Colin exclaimed. How dare you talk to my cousin like that? Why did you hurt her? I hurt her? Rosie was indignant. You've both been living here like pigs and I'm to blame. This is my apartment, and you have to live by my rules. Oh, so that's how you talk, Colin shouted. Have you forgotten that I made your apartment look decent? We used to live here like bums. Don't you dare say that, Rosie retorted. Yes, you did the repairs, but with our money. Fine, go ahead. Now you're going to lecture me about money. I can't take this anymore. I'm leaving tomorrow. Sandy, we're going to the capital tomorrow. Do you hear? She mumbled something in reply, and Colin rushed to the storeroom to get his suitcase. Rosie felt confused. Things hadn't been easy with Colin lately, but she couldn't lose him. He was her husband, the father of her child. Colin, stop. You don't have to go anywhere, she said more calmly. Yes, I overreacted. It was just a hard day. You're having a hard day, so you take it out on me and yell at Sandy. Colin closed the storeroom door, turned to Rosie and said sternly, Keep your emotions under control, please, or I won't tolerate it. I promise I'm sorry. Rosie pressed herself against her husband. I really overreacted. Okay, forget it, he said with a grin and hugged his wife. Let's consider the incident over. Rosie realised she had acted without self-respect, but she loved Colin. She would have to tolerate his relative, especially since Sandy promised to stay for only 2 weeks maximum. In the following days, Rosie came home to a less cluttered apartment. Sandy even tried to wash her mug and use the washing machine. Still, Rosie had to vacuum and wash the floors in the evenings and prepare food for the next day. Colin still went to work, but started coming home early these days. He said the firm had less work, and his boss let him go after learning about his cousin's visit. This suited Rosie as it meant Sandy wouldn't be alone in the apartment. Colin took her for walks by the river, to the park and to cafes. Of course, it bothered Rosie a bit that he paid more attention to his cousin, but she consoled herself that it was temporary. Soon Sandy would return to her husband and leave. However, things unfolded differently. That morning Rosie had a headache but still went to work. Her boss, seeing her pale face, immediately sent her home, saying she needed rest. At the entrance, Rosie ran into Sandy, who was hurrying somewhere, dressed up and wearing makeup. "Oh, Rosie, did you forget something?" Sandy smiled. "No, the boss let me go. I'll be home today," she answered, mentioning her headache. "Ah, well, take a pill. I'm off to check out one of the boutiques. Want to get myself a dress." Sandy left and Rosie began climbing the stairs. On the landing stood her neighbour, Mrs. Pimentel, who had been listening attentively to their conversation and now looked at Rosie with concern. Rosie said hello and tried to pass, but Mrs. Pimentel stopped her. "Rosie, I'm not trying to pry, but who is this girl? Why is she living in your apartment?" "This is Colin's cousin from the capital," Rosie answered tiredly as she walked. But Mrs. Pimentel held her hand. "Rosie, I know I'm meddling, but are you sure she's your Colin's cousin?" "Why do you ask?" Rosie was surprised. "Well, I've seen how they behave several times, and it's not like relatives," Mrs. Pimentel explained, frowning. "I'm sorry, old as I am, but I don't want you to be deceived. It pains me to see this." "What are you trying to say?" Rosie's heart twinged with foreboding. The worried neighbour explained that she had seen Colin and Sandy embracing on the landing through her peephole several times, and once caught them kissing in the car. "Kissing?" Rosie repeated in horror. "Yes, and not on the cheek," confirmed the neighbour. "They didn't notice me, but I was passing very close. Your car, and in it were Colin and this woman. God forgive me." "I understand, Mrs. Pimentel," Rosie muttered, grabbing the railing and struggling to continue walking. "Sweetheart, don't be angry with me, but I thought you should know the truth," her neighbour called after her. The truth! How it hurt Rosie. Was Colin cheating on her? Worse, had he brought his mistress into her apartment, and she, Rosie, had been cooking and cleaning for her? How revolting. Her head throbbed. Rosie took a pill and lay in the bedroom, trying to collect her thoughts. The headache subsided, but her heart ached with a different kind of pain. Could Colin have done something so terrible to her? Rosie sat up on the bed. If Mrs. Pimentel was right, there must be evidence she had overlooked. Sandy's passport. It would be with her now. But what good would that do? There wouldn't be any information about their relationship, and their surnames would be different anyway, since Colin had said his mother and Sandy's mother were sisters who had long been married. What to do? Rosie went to Sandy's room and carefully searched through her things. Nothing suspicious. She scanned the room. Nothing. Then she decided to look behind the couch. There she found something telling. Colin's underwear. Rosie distinctly remembered throwing it in the wash a week ago. They must have ended up there more recently. So, Mrs. Pimentel was right. Sandy wasn't a cousin, but a lover. Rosie recalled how Colin looked at Sandy, how she smiled at him. She had thought it was just a warm kin relationship, but now everything made sense. They were lovers, and the scoundrel had dared to bring her into their home. Her first impulse was to call Colin and tell him everything, but Rosie stopped herself. She didn't want to hear his excuses. He would only lie and make excuses. Instead, she went to the storeroom for a suitcase. He had wanted to leave her a few days ago anyway, so let him go to hell. She quickly packed Colin's things, which fortunately were few. He'd come with nothing, and he'd leave the same way. Though it was upsetting that she had bought him a car, that could be dealt with later. After packing her husband's things, she packed his mistress's belongings just as quickly, put everything in the stairwell, then slammed and locked the doors. These people would never cross her threshold again. Waiting for them to arrive was unbearable, and Rosie called her husband during his lunch break, deciding not to warn him about what awaited. She could deliver surprises too. "Yes, darling?" Colin answered, his voice slightly irritated. "Rosie, is it urgent? I just got to the cafe and lunch ends in half an hour." "Honey, you'll have to skip lunch today," Rosie replied, feigning friendliness. "You should ask your boss for a couple of hours off." "What's wrong? Something with Sandy?" Colin asked, alarmed. "Why would anything happen to Sandy? She's not home, but I am. And do you know why?" "How should I know?" Colin muttered. "Colin, I left my work today earlier because I couldn't focus at all. Dear, we won 200,000. I didn't tell you, but last week I bought a lottery ticket with my change at the store. I checked it this morning. It looks like we have a match. Can you believe it? I'm so excited, but I want you to verify it. I'm confused and don't know what to do next." "Are you kidding?" Colin asked incredulously. "No kidding, Colin. Come, see for yourself." "All right, I'll be there soon," he replied. After the conversation, Rosie smiled vindictively. Yes, she was hurt, but she would have her revenge. The lottery ticket was fiction, but her plan was sound. Colin would take the bait for money. Not even 30 minutes later, his car pulled up outside. Rosie waited behind the front door. "What the hell?" Colin exclaimed, then banged on the door. "Rosie, what's going on?" "Nothing," she replied from behind the door. "You just don't live here anymore. Take your things and leave with your mistress. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" "Mistress? Rosie, what are you talking about? Are you crazy?" Colin shouted. "I love only you." "And Sandy is just your cousin," Rosie sneered. "I know everything." Colin fell silent for a moment before erupting in profanity. His outburst revealed everything. He had met Sandy during his first marriage. His wife had discovered the affair. He had been the cheater, not her, and thrown him out. His parents had sided with his wife, especially since she was expecting their grandchild. Meanwhile, their son had gotten involved with Sandy, who had lied about having a wealthy husband when he was just a trucker. After Colin was rejected by both his wife and parents, Sandy returned to her husband. Why keep a failed lover? Colin tried settling in his hometown, but couldn't make it work. Then he met Rosie. Everything seemed perfect. Rosie adored him, and they had a mutual daughter together. Only Harriet had watched him suspiciously. She must have sensed something. Indeed, Sandy soon resumed visiting him. He'd make excuses to leave work, meet her at hotels, then return home to his wife, whom he found boring. At least she fulfilled his every whim, buying him a car, expensive clothes, preparing delicious meals. What more could he want? Then came a gift, Harriet's death. Colin had always feared her for some reason. When Sandy's husband discovered her affairs, he divorced her and threw her out. With nowhere to go, she called Colin, who suggested moving to his city. Since renting was expensive, the lovers met right under his wife's nose. Why not? They thought Rosie was too stupid, always working, to figure it out. They'd planned to claim Sandy's husband wouldn't take her back, hoping Rosie would pity her and help with rent. "You moral freak," Rosie spat when she realized whom she'd be living with. "I'm filing for divorce tomorrow." "Go ahead," Colin shrieked, "but I'll sue for the apartment. I have rights to it. I renovated it." "With my mother's money," Rosie laughed. "You won't get anything." "We'll see about that," Colin sneered. "And don't think about the car. It's registered to me." Rosie knew this, regretting putting the car in his name. "You didn't say anything about your daughter," she reminded him. "What do I need her for? You had her without asking me. Raise her yourself." Sandy's exclamations were heard outside the door, Apparently she had returned. She only sighed, gathered her things and went downstairs. Colin remained quiet as he picked up his suitcases and followed. Rosie stood outside the door. Surprisingly, she didn't feel like crying at all. Instead, she felt an immense relief, like after taking a shower, following exhausting work. That evening, the entire building buzzed with talk of how Rosie had thrown out her husband. Ignoring the gossip, she watched the locksmith change her front door locks. Colin would never cross her threshold again. Rosie worried most about how Dana would take the news that her father no longer lived with them, but surprisingly the girl reacted calmly. To be honest, he was always like a stranger to me. At first I was happy, but then I realised he didn't need me. He never asked about my life. He looked at me as if I didn't exist, she replied thoughtfully to Rosie when she returned from camp. Mum, it's good you broke up. I don't think he ever loved you. Don't be upset, you'll find your happiness. Don't worry about me. I won't cry any more if someone says I don't have a father, especially since I do have one. What a wise girl you are. Rosie sighed and hugged her daughter. The divorce from Colin followed. In court, he claimed part of the apartment, arguing he had invested significantly in it. However, Rosie easily proved that she had covered all material costs. Colin received nothing but the divorce decree. Rosie didn't even pursue alimony. Knowing what a headache it would be, she decided to raise her daughter alone. The car situation required lawyers. Though they couldn't recover the vehicle, they proved that Rosie's loan had paid for it. They managed to transfer the loan to Colin's name. Rosie continued life with her daughter. Looking back, she wondered how she could ever have been so naive to trust a man who had already trampled her feelings once. Indeed, someone who betrays once will betray again. Yet a year later, an extraordinary meeting changed her life forever. A request for cooperation arrived at work from a double-glazed windows supplier. The company found the proposal interesting, and Rosie arranged a meeting by email. To her surprise, Gabriel appeared at the meeting. The same man who had once helped her on a deserted highway, the one with whom a romance might have bloomed. Gabriel seemed slightly flustered too. After discussing business, he invited Rosie to dinner. "Won't your wife mind?" she teased. "There isn't one, and back then there was none either," he replied. "I told you the truth then. I live alone now. I've recently moved here and started a business. And did you get married?" "I'm already divorced," Rosie smiled sadly. "Is that so?" He raised his eyebrows and smiled. "So I still have a chance?" "Time will tell," Rosie said with a smile. And indeed, time revealed that these two couldn't live without each other. Rosie finally had her dream wedding, wearing white as Mendelssohn's March played, while Gabriel gazed at her lovingly, and Dana standing beside them. The girl was genuinely happy about her mother's marriage. Though she still called him Uncle Gabriel, Dana entertained the thought of one day calling him Daddy, as he treated her like a real father, consistently showing his support. Only Harriet, Rose's mother, wasn't present on that joyous day. But Rosie believed that if there was life beyond, her mother would be happy for her. She had found her happiness as a woman, her mother's deepest wish for her.